U.S. Surgeon General is warning tonight to expect new outbreaks of the coronavirus because of all the protests all across the country over the death of George Floyd. At most of those protests, thousands of people are gathered together in very close proximity. And that is the case again tonight. You are looking live at a protest right now taking place in Washington, D.C. And that is the same scene that we have been seeing playing out all week. Now, while a majority of protesters have been wearing masks, those large crowds make it difficult to social distance. And that, according to some experts, could lead to a possible second wave of the virus. Today, I spoke with Dr. Jason West, the owner of the West Clinic in Idaho, about that concern. Dr. West, thanks for joining us tonight. We have gone from staying inside for months to now seeing thousands of people taking to the streets of several cities across the country to protest the death of George Floyd. Is there a concern that those large gatherings could set off a second wave of the coronavirus?
Well, in a weird way, I mean, I hate the violence and I hate the destruction of personal property, the looting, but in a weird way, it's kind of a test for the coronavirus because it should have some increased areas of infection if there's a second wave coming. And if the protesters aren't having these infection rate increases, then maybe it's time we can open up churches and theaters and football events.
Yeah, if the virus does begin to spread, how long would it be before we know it?
Well, from what I understand from the literature, it's going to be 2 or 3 weeks. And, we're looking for a dry cough, a fever, an increased, feeling of unwellness. And then hopefully there's a process where the protesters could get tested if that's what's happening, but it's going to be a couple weeks.
Well, as you know, these protests come while many cities are reopening, but there is no social distancing during most of these protests. Some are wearing face masks, but do you think that those actually help in a situation like that?
I personally have some concerns that they really aren't that beneficial. Usually what the literature is saying is that the N95 masks have the right pore size, the homemade mask or the modified mask. I think the virus is a lot smaller than the pore size, and I'm just not convinced that it's really going to be that helpful.
Okay, well, let's talk about tear gas. Police have used that on some of the protesters. That makes your eyes water, and you usually end up touching your eyes. It also makes you cough. Isn't that how the virus is spread?
Well, it could be, and what you have to remember is it's the body's trying to get rid of things, so the mucous membranes turn on, you get all the tears coming out, you're coughing to try and get rid of things, and I'm not so certain that in a weird way it's not going to basically push things out. I'm not convinced that it's really going to make it more susceptible for the infection.
Really? Well, in your opinion, do you think that protesters should be tested for COVID-19?
Well, the whole protesting thing is so, I guess, emotionally and spiritually confusing to me because, yes, I think it was tragic what another human being did to a human being. The protesting, the destruction of property and the rioting and stuff, I don't see how that really helps. I certainly understand why you would want social reform from this tragedy, from these horrible circumstances. And so for them to get special treatment for testing or anything like that, I don't see the difference for what they would get tested versus someone else. I just think that there's more productive ways to create change.
Well, most of the larger protests that we've been seeing are taking place in larger cities. There are some reports that some people from smaller towns are traveling to those larger cities to join in those protests. Is there a fear that those people could be exposed during the protests and then take the coronavirus back with them to their home city?
Of course there is. I mean, if you think about what was trying to do with flattening the curve, we wanted to minimize the impact or the wave that was going to go into the healthcare system. And if there is protesters that are paying attention, I mean, if you can help your immune system to be healthy, which is water and vitamin C and vitamin A and vitamin D, zinc, and some of these other things I think would be beneficial. If you want to minimize your impact, at least do some of the things to keep your immune system healthy.
And a majority of the people protesting are African American, and it's known that the virus affects Black Americans more than white Americans. Why is that, and is that a concern?
Well, I think what's happening is it's an example of genetics. You get bad DNA from your mom or your dad, and some people it's going to cause autoimmune problems. And in certain populations, it just seems that they're a little bit more susceptible. And again, what we want to do is to try and help their immune systems be as healthy as possible prior to any exposure and prior to spreading it to anybody else.
And that was Dr. Jason West in Idaho tonight.